All right, welcome. Welcome to What's Around the Corner. My name's Cooper Rinsler. I'm a partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures. I'm so psyched to be here. What an amazing summit it's been. We're nearly at the end. We've heard so much about the progress we've made in so many different innovations, from grid decarbonization to the built environment. And while we've made a ton of progress, there's still some pretty big gaps in terms of getting to our climate goal. And what is that climate goal exactly? We talk a lot about mitigation. We talk about net zero by 2050. We talk about 1.5C by 2100. But what we actually care about is getting to a stabilized climate at a safe temperature. And what we mean by stable is a climate that roughly remains at the same average temperature over long periods of time with minimum intervention. And that's what we've had for the last about 11,000 years in a period called the Holocene. For the last several million years, the Earth has been in this very stable cycle of glacial and interglacial cycles. And there's feedback loops that keeps the Earth in those cycles. But what climate change really risks is knocking us out of that equilibrium into uncharted territory. And there's no more scary indication of the possibility of what we unlock with climate change and knocking us out of this and destabilizing us than the notion of tipping points, which you've all heard of. And they're so named because once you knock down the domino, there's no putting it back up. They're nonlinear phenomenon. We're talking about things like the Greenland ice sheet melting, or the Atlantic Meridian ocean current flipping directions, which would put London in an instant ice age. And what's kind of crazy is that these things can cascade. They can stack on each other. One can cause the other. And then often, many of them actually contribute themselves to additional warming. So what do we mean by a safe temperature when we talk about a safe, stable climate? Really, we're talking about temperatures that don't hit tipping points, that don't unlock tipping points, and temperatures at which humans can truly thrive. So, how do we avoid tipping points? You know, what's a roadmap to a stabilized climate look like? And what are the tools that we're gonna need? That's what we're gonna talk about here today in this session. We're gonna hear from some amazing innovators. So the first step is, of course, CO2. We all know this. We cannot get where we need to go without solving CO2. We need to get to net zero or even net negative. And we've made immense progress on things like the EV transition, renewables deployment, even HVAC. This summit, you may have heard about innovation in steel and cement and hard-to-decarbonize sectors that looks promising. You've even heard about negative emissions technologies like graphite or like DAC technologies, which is phenomenal. But there's still some pretty big gaps out there, even in the CO2 story. Nowhere is that more potent than in the transportation space, specifically shipping and aviation. And here to talk about a little bit about the shipping and aviation industries and introduce some of our innovators is my colleague, Christian Garcia, partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures.
All right, thank you. Hey everyone. Well, as Coop mentioned, long-haul maritime shipping is one of the very difficult sectors for us to decarbonize. Represents a gigaton annually. One of the reasons why it is so difficult is because the industry is hyper optimized around cost. And all of the elements, the containers, the ports, the routes themselves, are hyper optimized around very large vessels that run on bunker fuel, which is literally the bottom of the barrel of what comes out of a refinery. So how do you displace that? Well, as we have said, throughout the summit, you've got to be cheaper and you've got to be better. And conventional wisdom would tell you that's nearly impossible to do with an electric battery, and certainly we had that view for a time. And then Stephen came to us and he said, look, I can be cheaper and I can be better, and let me tell you why, and let me walk you through how we're going to stair-step our way through to electrification, right? Through hybrids, through retrofits, and eventually to new builds. So I'm very pleased to introduce Steve Henderson, CEO and founder of Fleet Zero.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. I'm Stephen Henderson, one of the co-founders and CEO of Fleet Zero. We build really big batteries for ships. When I first started thinking about the problem of decarbonizing shipping, I came from an oil and gas and shipping background. I worked with diesel engines, with steam turbines. These engines are massive and powerful, and I really didn't think batteries would have a chance. I was probably one of the chief skeptics, and the folks on our team, also having a maritime background, you don't think about batteries as something that can make an impact on a vehicle that's the size of this building. So ships are basically the largest mobile objects, man-made objects. And when we first started looking at this, the skepticism is something that's maybe our chief focus is how do we convey the math of the progress that's happened with batteries from all the work with EV vehicles. You've got increased energy density, lower cost, higher performance batteries. And what we've realized is that with batteries in ships, you can actually step into this problem. You don't have to go zero emissions immediately. You can add batteries to an existing vessel, immediately hybridize it, reduce emissions, increase its CII score, which is a regulatory mechanism, and over time increase the amount of batteries you put on a vessel, decreasing its emissions more and more over time. Because of the great advantages in batteries, you've got much higher efficiency in powertrain. You can use existing infrastructure, unlike maybe drop in lower carbon fuels like methanol, hydrogen, ammonia, where you need new distribution, global storage infrastructure that you can't use existing oil and gas tanks for methanol, for hydrogen. With batteries, you can use existing electricity and grid. Obviously, you have to build more. But we actually think that electrifying ships, much like electrifying cars, is actually a pathway to decarbonize the grid. It's hard to replace an existing power plant if you have the same load, but you want to go to a cleaner power plant. But if you add a much greater demand for electricity, like a port like LA, you can build new, clean infrastructure based on that increased demand. So we actually see shipping as, even though it's only 3% of global emissions, I think it's one of the sort of unique areas where it's a concentrated load that will actually drive change outside of that sector in the grid. So thank you, and
All right. Well, in the category of really, really hard things, let's talk about aviation. I think everyone here probably understands how difficult that is. And what I can say, I think the sad reality is that there are no silver bullets on aviation. The way that we've approached it at BEV is to try to segment the problem. And in doing so, we believe that regional aviation matters. Short flights matter. 50% of all departures are under 1,000 kilometers. Average route for a regional airline is 600 kilometers, 400 in Europe. And these are routes that are very CO2 intensive per kilometer because of the emissions at takeoff and taxi. These are routes that are going to continue to grow, particularly in the developing world. And these are routes that we think can be addressed with new propulsion technologies. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Anders Forslund, CEO and founder of HART.
Thanks, Christian. So I run a company called HART Aerospace, and the mission of the company is to decarbonize and democratize air travel. And I think Christian mentioned a lot of the sort of data that I was going to start talking about, but essentially 1/3 of emissions from aviation are coming from short-haul flights. Those flights can be electrified. And as you start looking at that problem, you realize that it's not just about decarbonizing these flights, but actually creating a new type of propulsion system that reduces the cost. So I think we've heard throughout this conference about the green premium, the idea of when we're bringing these new green technologies to the market, they actually are coming in at a substantially higher price than the fossil fuel-based technologies they're replacing. The exciting thing about when you go battery electric for aircraft is that you can reduce these costs. And especially if you look at the short-haul segment, the prevailing technology that we have, the jet engine, is actually only designed for that cruise segment of flight. So when you're at taxi, when you're at takeoff, and when you're going down to land, you're actually using a lot more fuel than you should. So a flight that's, say, 200 kilometers wastes about, or uses about twice the amount of fuel per kilometer as a flight that's 1,000 kilometers. So when you go electric, you can really optimize that. And I think everybody that has an electric car can relate to this, because if you're driving in city traffic or something like that, you see that real gain in fuel efficiency. And that's why we see so many taxis taking over, going over to electric. So we're building that aircraft to prove that. So we started about 5 years ago by demonstrating a propulsion system that's electric and be built the size of a jet engine. We then looked at all the other systems that on the aircraft that you have to also make sure that they work on electricity, that they're also works in every corner case. And actually this year we're rolling out our full-scale demonstrator aircraft that we're going to first start ground taxi testing in August. And in April next year, we're going to be at our first flight. At that, we're going to be rapidly moving, actually building this sort of production process in parallel. We're working with a process called concurrent engineering. So we're designing the plane and the production process in parallel. And we're going to get to a conforming aircraft that we're going to iterate rapidly on and bring through certification and get to the point where we have type certification with the EASA in 2028 and enter into service shortly thereafter. So thank you.
Well, that's exciting. We know we can't get where we need to go without solving the CO2 problem, and especially in hard to decarbonize sectors like we just heard about. But CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. We know this. And while we can't get where we need to go without solving CO2, we actually got to solve things like methane, nitrous oxide, and all of these other greenhouse gases, of course. And why do we care about greenhouse gases? CO2 actually matters in its own right. A high concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere actually can cause ocean acidification or human health consequences. But really the reason we care mostly is the temperature effect, of course. And the reason why these greenhouse gases offer a temperature effect is because they create an imbalance in the energy between the amount of energy the Earth absorbs and the amount it emits. And the Earth just heats up to try and re-equilibrate. We call that energy imbalance radiative forcing. And actually, it's radiative forcing that we need to be focused on when we talk about getting to a safe, stable climate. We cannot get to a stable climate without getting to stable radiative forcing. Now, the big contributors to radiative forcing, no surprise, CO2, it's number one. Well, actually, it's water, but that's a different story. But there's others that matter, right? Methane, nitrous oxide, black carbon, et cetera. There's also negative radiative forcing, things that net cool. Things like sulfur aerosols, some of which come out of the back end of ships or volcanoes, or also NOx emissions, believe it or not, as bad as they are, they contribute to additional cloud cover, which can sometimes be net cooling. What we care about is the total amount of radiative forcing. A radiative forcing of 0 would mean that we'd get to a temperature that's the same as pre-industrialization. So we need to stabilize radiative forcing. And so let's talk about the next big offender. Let's talk about methane. Methane's responsible for nearly half of all total warming to date. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. The big anthropogenic contributions, we all know, oil and gas is obviously a big offender there, not intentionally, but it's there. I actually feel strangely optimistic about our oil and gas methane emissions because there are a number of solutions that have been identified that are cost neutral or cost negative to actually address the majority of these emissions. What we've lacked is the will to actually enact these changes, but let's hope that we can solve that. Coal, hopefully going by the wayside, of course. And then let's talk about landfill emissions. So landfills emit methane because of all the organics, specifically food waste, that we dump into the landfills, which can break down into methane. One of our portfolio companies, Mill, is working on organics diversion from landfills. Rice, the next big contributor, huge contribution to methane. One of our portfolio companies, Rise, is working on alternative agricultural practices and helping farmers transition to them that can actually be way less methane emittive, but even more importantly, more productive and profitable for those growers at the same time. So that's great. We've got a lot of solutions, but then, of course, you look at the pie chart and where's the kahuna? It's cows. Right? It's ruminant eggs, and we cannot get to a stabilized climate without solving for cows, to quote Professor Toon. And cows make methane when they digest feed in a process called enteric fermentation. It occurs in one of their stomachs called the rumen, and it's driven by microbes. Some of those microbes make methane. And there's really 5 ways to think about decarbonizing the methane from cows. The first thing you could do is replace the cow. Right? You could have alternative dairy like Alpine Bio or alternative protein like Nature's Find, or maybe even cellular agriculture, cultured meat like Prolific Machines. So that's one way you could think about going. The next thing you could do is to make cows more efficient. Let's get as much milk, as much meat out of the cow per unit methane that's being produced. One of our portfolio companies, Neutral, is working with growers that are implementing the best practices to make for the most efficient, lowest climate intensity dairy on the planet today, which is great. You can do direct mitigation. So this is all about getting right into that rumen, and disrupting the microbes that make methane while leaving the microbes that are responsible for digestion intact. We'll hear a little bit more about that in a second. Or, worst comes to worse, once the cow burps, you could deal with the methane once it's created, right? Either locally to the cow, or maybe once it's in the atmosphere. We call that post-emissions mitigation. So here to introduce some amazing concepts in enteric fermentation are two innovators. I'm psyched to first introduce David Messina from Ruminate.
Thanks, Cooper. Ruminate, what do? We develop supplements that reduce methane by up to 90% in cattle. We're also seeing productivity gains of between 5 and 10%. So what that means is a litre of milk extra per day, or an extra steak per day, each cow and every cow every day. Amazing advancements through supplements, great support from groups like Breakthrough and Prelude, who have been fantastic at taking us on this journey over the last 2 years. But enteric methane equates to the same amount of emissions as the global aviation industry. And we get less than 1% of funding, either through direct private funding or government or subsidies or industry. We've got this massive problem. Methane is 20 times more potent in over a 10-year period, 85 times more potent over a 10-year period than CO2. It's a great lever to pull if we target reducing methane, but we're not seeing the support in both funding, in policy, in industry that the aviation industry is getting as a direct comparison on emissions alone. So the challenge, I think, for livestock is how do we make them better and more efficient? There's great technology coming through. We've got some technology that we believe we're going to be in the market in 2 years' time. So we're on the cusp of rolling that out globally through our 20 trial program, which we've done in Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, US most recently, Europe coming. Really exciting, but it's still not getting the engagement, and it seems to be a general lack of understanding of just how important it could be to buy a small time to roll out some of those other technologies that are going to take longer, whether that's alternate food sources or wherever else we're finding alternatives, which we know take a lot of capital and a lot of time. Methane is our lever to pull, and I think if it's anything to take away is there's great technology coming through. We've got one of them, but the industry needs hundreds of millions of dollars, not tens of millions of dollars, because we need 10 versions of what we're doing. And we need to be layering these new technology so that we can actually give ourselves the runway to actually make a difference in the existing food industry. We don't need to be changing it. We've got the technology, we've got the drive, and we've got the entrepreneurs who are just looking for the support right through the value chain. And that includes the regulators and the policymakers. We're not looking for special treatment, but we're looking for some prioritisation in actually just getting updated policies through that will actually just enable this technology to get to market and encourage others to follow. And I think just finally, methane and the livestock industry is generally unliked, but it has a massive impact. And so we need to change people's views, investors, policymakers, government, that we need to actually improve and encourage improving what we have already that we've been doing for thousands of years. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And he said it. I'll say ruminant ag has probably been the most underfunded to biggest impact sector in all of our present emissions for so long. That's finally starting to change just a little bit with places like the Enteric Fermentation Alliance coming on board, but it's still, we're orders of magnitude off in terms of the amount of funding we need, even on some of the basic research. And importantly, the global herd is mostly grazers, not intensified dairy. And so the solution sets that we need to be able to apply to cows that are out there in pasture. Here to talk about a really novel solution in that light is Colin South from Archaea Bio.
Hi guys, I thought, where we are, with this group in the room, we could kind of have a William Wallace moment where we all kind of get together, but then I thought we're a little too close to Tower Bridge. I wasn't up for it today, so. We use magic to get rid of methane. And it really is. I mean, when you look at a vaccine, we're talking about delivering a dose to an animal that's about 1 milligram and getting methane mitigated by the use of the antibodies that are produced there and in the saliva to push down the level of methane produced in the rumen. And it does that by using 150 litres a day of saliva that your average cow makes, and it goes down and we target specifically those organisms that create methane. And it really is magic, but the real magic in it is it gives us a solution that we can address those grazed cattle worldwide. We can have a singular solution to a really large distributed problem. The technology David was talking about came out of work on seaweed. So you've got the active ingredient out of there. David pulls that out and uses it and concentrates its form and its action way more than you can get with the seaweed. But if I look at the seaweed example for logistics, to address the entire population of animals in the world, 1.2 billion ruminant cows, we'll just stay with cattle because of the majority of the problem, we could do that with 4 tons of active ingredient. If you take and grow seaweed and then distribute that out as a daily feed additive, it would take 7 million tons. The logistics, the execution, the challenges are vastly different when you're working with a vaccine than they are when you're working with anything else. The channels that we need in terms of manufacturing assets, in terms of go-to-market channels, they all exist. 75% of all animals worldwide receive vaccines. Many of them are mandated for things like foot and mouth or brucellosis. So there's existing channels going out to those farmers, to those markets, and at scale that we can use. And so as a solution set, it's perfect. The challenges are reasonably large because we've got more than one organism. We're not targeting a coronavirus, we're targeting 100 species in the rumen. We don't have to kill them because it's a flow-through system. They'll wash out. If you annoy them enough and make them grow slowly enough, they'll wash out. So it's a process that has been hypothesized for 25 years. The Australians started working at CSIRO on this 25 years ago. That was 6 years before the Human Genome Project. The toolkit that we work with now, there's $40 billion a year of research goes on in the healthcare and biotechnology industries that continues to evolve it. And so our opportunities to move really, really quickly with a unique tool set are amazing. And that's what we make our living off. And I'll take 10 extra seconds here to say that we'll be putting a paper out, a presentation out soon, which shows that we've had the first known response to a vaccine to show methane mitigation in animals in vivo. So we're very excited about the path forward with vaccines. Thank you.
ISA, I am genuinely so thrilled for both of those innovations you just heard about. Both are scalable solutions that with very, very low cost entitlement can address the global herd. And 10 years ago, none of them were thought possible, really. It's a totally new world when it comes to hope for enteric fermentation at this time. So it's wonderful to have these scalable solutions. In reality, we know that we're going to probably use a combination of those 5 pathways to decarbonize cows. It's a good thing that we have all 5. Let's do all that we can to replace, to make them more efficient, to do direct mitigation. But at the end of the day, there's probably still going to be some methane. And whether it's from cows or landfills or oil and gas, et cetera, there's going to be some anthropogenic methane emissions. And what we can do in those cases is actually talk about post-emissions mitigation, which is dealing with the methane once it's made. One of our portfolio companies, M2X, is working on a solution that does just this in the oil and gas industry, turning waste methane that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere into green methanol. And here to talk about an extremely novel biological solution that turns waste methane into value is Josh Silverman from Windfall Bio.
Thanks, Cooper. hopefully you guys can hear me. Appreciate the chance to talk to you all. So I'm Josh Silverman, CEO of Windfall Bio. What Windfall does is we actually have a biological technology that allows us to oxidize methane at ambient temperatures and pressures with essentially no CapEx or OpEx. And what our organisms do, is these are naturally occurring microorganisms from the soil, they essentially eat that methane as food and then use the energy that they take from that methane to also pull nitrogen out of the air, and they produce a high-value organic nitrogen fertilizer directly on site. And the reason we can do this, and we can do this profitably for the farmers, for the operators, whoever has access to that methane, is because methane has energy. And as we heard from Eric Toon yesterday, energy is prosperity. And the main difference, Cooper's been talking a lot about the warming potential of methane versus CO2, and absolutely methane significantly warms the atmosphere more than CO2, but the other main difference is methane has a lot more energy. So CO2 is the bottom of the thermodynamic energy well. It is the lowest energy form of carbon. Anything you want to do to CO2, to capture it, sequester it, modify it, transform it, everything is uphill, everything requires energy, and energy is expensive. And so that's why when we talk about CO2 capture, mitigation, closer? Okay, sorry. Then these are things that are always an extra cost. And then the question for all of these climate technologies is who pays? And we know consumers don't want to pay, especially when we talk about developing countries and developing nations. We know producers don't want to pay, again, especially in developing nations. And so this is where we really have a challenge in how do we actually fund a lot of these technology solutions. Methane, though, is the opposite, right? Methane is the highest energy naturally occurring form of carbon. There's a reason we use so much natural gas as a power source. It's because methane is full of energy. And so these organisms, which naturally occur in the soil, they live in the soil, they grow without any extra source of energy. They're able to use everything within the methane. And not only can they capture sources from more concentrated places like landfills, like oil and gas, like dairy manure piles, they can also pull methane directly out of the atmosphere at 2 parts per million because there's enough energy in those molecules that actually drives that capture. And as they're doing this, it's creating a value-add product that's absolutely directly useful to the operators, and we're allowing those operators, those farmers, to be able to capture that value, either reduce their own costs. Farmers who use our solution can reduce their fertilizer cost by 50%. Versus buying fertilizer on the market, versus oil and gas companies and landfills can actually sell that fertilizer and create a revenue stream and drive a profitable business in reducing their methane emissions. So we hope by using this, we can square that circle and create incentives for people to actually capture methane without relying on external subsidies or credits. So thank you.
How cool is that? I mean, holy crap, methane-eating microbes, right? I love it. So, as Josh mentioned, methane is a short-term forcer. It's very potent, right? But it actually only has a lifetime of about 12 years in the atmosphere. That means that if we could rapidly accelerate our methane mitigation solutions, we could give ourselves a heck of a lot more time to deal with the energy transition and get our CO2 game under check, because methane warms so much, so quickly. Okay, let's talk about the next big offender, nitrous oxide. This one's fun. It's even more concentrated in terms of potency and in terms of where the emissions come from. 298 more times potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. The supermajority comes from the agriculture space, nearly 3/4 of emissions, and the supermajority of that is fertilizer. Fertilizer is amazing, right? We could not feed half the planet if we didn't have nitrogen fertilizer. Nearly 60% of the nitrogen in your bodies making up all your proteins came through a Haber-Bosch plant, which is the principal way by which we fix nitrogen to make synthetic fertilizer. It's crucial. Unfortunately, there's some downsides. Consumes about 1% of global energy emissions, more than that of natural gas, and then a huge chunk of nitrous oxide emissions. And even worse, today, on average globally, only 50% of the nitrogen that a farmer applies actually ends up in the plant. The remainder goes and washes into waterways, causing eutrophication, or goes and volatilizes into the atmosphere. That's a problem for the planet, but it's really a problem for the growers themselves, because they're paying for something that they don't know reliably gets into the plant. So, and until now, there's been no choice, because we're gonna feed ourselves. Food security is king, and until now. Food security is still king, but we had another solution until now. I'm here to talk about a really exciting solution in the fertilizer space is Chris Abbott from Pivot Bio. Pivot has a solution that takes a 99% plus reduction in the total emissions of fertilizer compared to synthetic, but while providing a solution that's actually better for the grower themselves and the planet simultaneously. We'll do a video first, and then Chris will come on up.
If we're going to feed this world in 2050, we've got to get better. And Pivot Bio helps us do that.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to have a walk-up video and music. Thank you, everyone, for having us and for Breakthrough for a wonderful event. As Coop mentioned, I'm Chris Abbott, CEO of Pivot Bio. And Coop stole the lead-in. So why nitrogen and why are we here? Well, we can't feed. Half of us would be dead if we didn't have it. But it's also a critical component to a grower's business. So we always think about nitrogen. It starts with our customer and it starts with the grower. It's why we show these videos. You see, those are real customers of ours using our products in corn, in wheat. We'll roll out cotton later. But for those that can't see the slide, the whole premise is we continue to tax our demand on nitrogen. That's going up and not down. In the United States, we overapply nitrogen. In places like Brazil or North Africa, we underapply. We need more nitrogen. We need more food. We need more output. And so we're in a bit of a pickle here. So if we take what Coop highlighted, which is the Haber-Bosch process, and that's taking natural gas using intensive energy, fixing nitrogen, the technical term of creating ammonia, we at Pivot Bio figured out how to do that with a microbe. What does that mean? Well, it's invisible bacteria that can do that through the production of an enzyme called nitrogenase. So now you're taking N2, which is the most abundant thing in our air, and you're converting it to ammonia. But more importantly, those microbes, they live on the root system of plants. And so what happens is that plant grows. Through photosynthesis, plants secrete sugar. It goes through the root exudate system. They're feeding the environment in which it lives. It's a very symbiotic host and plant relationship. Our microbes live on the root system, and so you create the spoon feed mechanism. This microbe is producing nitrogen all year, which is when corn plants need it. Just like we need food to grow, plants need food to grow. So in season, they need more nitrogen. That's where the problem comes in. Weather is always volatile. It's getting more volatile. As it rains, massive drought and heat stress, nitrogen volatilizes. Coop mentioned goes down in the rivers. I live in the United States. We've got a huge problem in the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. It volatilizes to nitrous oxide. That's another problem. From a sustainability perspective, it's obvious, but it's as obvious for a grower. Tight margin commodity business, huge CapEx, unpredictability. I mean, that's a tough business to run. It's also a tough business when your number one input cost is wasted at a rate of 50% a year. So how do you deal with these things? Well, what we've done is we've taken these microbes and it's now a seed coating. So you saw, and I've got a box here of our first liquid product. You saw a number of our growers pouring that into their tanks. Now it's a seed coating. What happens is you plant your corn, wheat, cotton, some of the small grains where it's coated with our product. Those microbes go to work as soon as that plant is planted and starts to germinate. So you start to think through the supply chain ramifications of that and performance. I don't have to apply fertilizer. I don't have to ship fertilizer. Our product, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, is 1/20,000th the scale of urea. So to give you an example of what that means, this is the first product, which isn't the best. This would be 320 pounds, 145 kgs of urea in this box. Our seed coating product is 1.8 grams an acre. For all of us Americans that don't know what that means, that's 250 acres per pound. So now you're talking about, like, this is a field of fertilizer in my hand. So it's just this quantum shift, and it's attached to the root system. So I've got pictures here. Most of you won't be able to see them given the size of the screen. But what's powerful is this year in the United States, we've had a wet spring. Not crazy wet, pretty wet, 39% more moisture. So we're not talking double, triple the rain, but 4 inches more, 16 versus 12 inches where I live in the Twin Cities. But it's everywhere. I mean, the pictures you can see there on the bottom are the most powerful. We have fields in Nebraska and in Tennessee, so different places in the Midwest. Nebraska is the #1 corn state in the United States. So much nitrogen loss because of moisture. We have plants 100% taller using 40 pounds less synthetic nitrogen. That's 25% less synthetic nitrogen in a plant that's 100% taller. You can see there's a picture in Tennessee that actually shows that plant's from the same field. So it's a pretty powerful thing to stand in front of a grower and say, okay, #1 input cost is synthetic fertilizer. It's your #1 wasted element. It's your #1 determining factor of yield, and it's your #1 contribution to sustainability issues. You got to fix it. Our seed coating now, thanks to a lot of work that our team did this year, is now the same price as synthetic fertilizer. We have virtually zero CapEx. So if I go back to that picture, you think of a Haber-Bosch facility. It's $4 billion to build or buy a Haber-Bosch facility. Produces a whole bunch of nitrogen that we all need. For $10 million, I can be on 100% of US corn acres at 230% higher gross margin. So we've reached this fundamental tectonic shift in terms of business model innovation, not only for growers, but for our own company. And so what does that actually mean? Well, we're on several million acres in the US. We've taken out about 1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Again, nitrous oxide is an important metric for us, so we don't just think about CO2, obviously. But that's in really just the last 2 years. And those are permanently avoided, right? I mean, you didn't use nitrogen. You permanently avoid that, both nitrous oxide risk of it in the field, as well as the attacks on the environment to produce, ship, and apply that synthetic fertilizer in bulk commodities. When you think about water usage, 1,000 times less water, producing nitrogen is actually sort of a quiet killer of that water because it takes so much water in that process to fix nitrogen. And so we've started to quantify this. We've got a team that builds wonderful impact reports. It's the same in the last 2 years as taking 2.5 gas-fired power plants offline. And we're just scratching the surface of US corn. Next year, we'll roll into Brazil. We'll roll into Canada. We're gonna add cotton. So you start to think about the order of magnitude of the impact, and it's pretty powerful, not just in our developing countries like the US, but also in places like Africa where the supply chain benefits from that quantum of scale. I've shown a little bit here, I wanna give you a sort of order of magnitude when I talk about supply chain. Anyone who's been in any supply chain and shipping business knows a 1-ton tote. We need 108 of those. It's the equivalent of 50 cargo ships of urea, virtually. So we've now just tectonically shifted nitrogen. It's paired with synthetic. As I mentioned before, we now have the ability to deliver a better solution for growers and for the planet at the same or better economics. And certainly very lucky to be here with the awards that we've won in recognition, as well as the partnership with Breakthrough. Thank you.
Amazing. Okay, did we do it? Did we solve it? Boom, CO2 done, methane done, nitrous oxide done. We did it, we hit it all, right? Unfortunately, turns out not all emissions are just anthropogenic emissions. We all talk about net zero, we all talk about anthropogenic emissions, but that's not the whole story. In fact, for methane, nearly half of all emissions that contribute to the methane concentration in the atmosphere are natural, from sources like the wetlands. And unfortunately, these are subject to positive feedback loops. The warmer it gets, the more methane is emitted from these natural sources. Also subject to tipping points. What if the permafrost thaws, creating a whole new source of potential methane in the atmosphere? Same's true for CO2. The warmer it gets, the less capacity for CO2 the oceans have. Of course, you can guess, same for nitrous oxide. Actually, the majority of nitrous oxide emissions are natural today, and of course, subject to positive feedback loops, as are the anthropogenic systems. It gets more inefficient with synthetic. So So what does that mean? That means that getting to anthropogenic net zero is actually insufficient because our goal isn't net zero. Our goal is a stable climate at a safe temperature. That means we need to consider all sources of emissions. What do we do about this? Well, there's some emergent solutions that are beginning to form. Very incipient, but the concept of atmospheric renewal is now present in the system. So think about this as an analogy for direct air capture, which does CO2, but for things like methane and nitrous oxide. You know, unlike CO2, Josh mentioned it, methane, it's got a lot of energy to give up. It doesn't want to be methane. Same's true with nitrous oxide. Methane wants to be CO2 in the atmosphere, right? And that's why it has a short shelf life of only 12 years, right, in the atmosphere. What would happen if we could simply increase the rate of that conversion and accelerate that pace? We could knock out 85% plus of the radiative forcing and hence warming effect of methane if we were able to do so. That's incredible. So this is a very, very incipient field. I'm really grateful for a number of the folks at Breakthrough and in the ecosystem surrounding us, like Rob Jackson, Guido Rodelli, Eric Scher, Josh Silverman, that have been part of this. I want a shout out to Spark Climate Solutions, who's really helping to move this field forward right now. Something truly around the corner, but a reason for hope here. So what if we did that too, right? What if we got rid of all of the natural sources of emissions and we were able to knock out all of that in addition to all the anthropogenic sources? Is that sufficient? Well, 1.5C is kind of here already. Like we hear this in the news, right? Is it 1.2? Is it 1.5? Whatever. Climate change is here. We know that. And so we've historically really formulated this problem in the concept of like preventative medicine, right? Where we think about, hey, if we could avoid climate change, that'd be great. But since it's here, it's much more like an acute condition, whether it be what recently has happened with the Hajj and Mecca, or we heard about in New Delhi recently. It's here. And that means we're moving into an era where actually we're going to need to think about this as a chronic condition. We're going to actually have to actively be playing a role to adapt to and potentially directly engage with the climate for the indefinite future. And that's scary, right? That's daunting because that's a really big task. And I think it's really important for us to keep in mind what our end goal is, a safe, temperature, stabilized climate. But what's the path that we take to get there? You know, I propose that we want to take the minimum cost, minimum suffering path to get there. And we want to do so in such a way that minimizes the risk of those tipping points that we talked about earlier. And at the end of the day, we want it to require the minimum amount of intervention, direct intervention, for us to maintain that stability. And we've got 4 playbooks to think about getting there. The first is mitigation, of course, by eliminating our emissions, maybe even actively removing some of our emissions. We have adaptation, which we'll talk more about in a second. And then we have intervention, things like directly engaging with radiative forcing management. And these are the tools that we have. Let's talk about adaptation. You know, it's a complex, nuanced topic. It can cover things as diverse as human migration, to infrastructure hardening and resilience, to food and water security, or even socio-politics, geopolitics. And it's really important to note that adaptation is not a replacement for mitigation, not whatsoever. Mitigation is the best bang for your buck that we got to reduce climate damage. You know, we really, if you think about a net cost of climate change framework, mitigation can really, really knock that down if we take aggressive action. Maybe it costs something represented here in red. We call it here the green premium. All of us are working together to bring that green premium down to 0 or maybe even negative, right? But some of the climate change is already here. What do we do for the climate change that's going to come as we continue to transition? Well, we can adapt. And what adaptation is really all about is taking the climate change that is coming and minimizing the effect that it has on humans, right? And that might cost some money, but it's well worth it. But there might be some climate change that we just can't adapt to, or that we choose not to adapt to. We refer to that as residual climate damage. And so no matter what we do, you know, and as hopeful as we should be with all the evidence of innovation at the summit, climate is going to be a megatrend for the coming century. That's why we're building multi-trillion-dollar industries here, right? And it's going to cover everything from wildfire to water security. We've got portfolio companies working on both, Data Blanket, Source Global. But it might, you know, it's going to affect so much of what we do, the actuarial basis for society, but maybe nothing as much as food and water, which food and agriculture, which Chris had already mentioned. And you know, a single day of an extreme heat event or an extreme weather event can knock out productivity for both crop and animal agriculture. It really begs the question: what does a future of a resilient agricultural system really look like for us? Savor is a company that's working to make the same fats that you and I, well, me especially, you can tell, love to eat on a daily basis, right? But in a totally different way that can really radically reduce the emissions. And in that way, we might consider it a replacement technology, like we discussed earlier. But if you listen closely, I think you'll hear a different vision for what the future of resilient agriculture might entail. So here to talk about it is my friend Kathleen Alexander from Savor.
Awesome. Warning, you might want to take a look at the pictures here because there's some good ones. This is our planet. We are literally the luckiest humans in the known universe. Thank you. I know I'm starting full cliche on you here, but I'm doing it on purpose because I think it's important that we level set, because this is what's at stake. For the last 100 years, we have all been participants in something of a devil's bargain, because we have traded this for this again and again. We have literally covered 50% of the habitable land on this planet with crops that use the sun's energy at less than 1% efficiency. But in exchange, we can produce enough food to feed 8 billion humans. That is monumental. In the developed world, we are not thinking about famine. We are not thinking about starvation. We are thinking about whether or not to have that ice cream for dessert. Now, ice cream is not on trial. Ice cream may be the purest manifestation of human genius. However, I would like us to interrogate the manifestation of human genius over the last 100 years, because in other sectors of the economy, we have seen unbelievable transformation. We have seen wood to coal to nuclear, wind, and solar. We have seen telegraphs to phones to satellites. And of course, we have seen horses to planes, trains, and automobiles. And for our food system, abundant, ingenious as it may be, we have settled for the faster horse. And so at Savor, we are trying to get off that horse and into the automobile. Yeah, so let's do it. How do we feed our species without consuming our planet? Much like the conversion from horses to automobiles, we fundamentally think this is a challenge of moving primary energy down the value chain. What is the closest thing to primary energy that humans can consume? We all have this little thing called a cellular metabolism. That means that we still have to consume carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So what is the most efficient way to get from primary energy to carbohydrates, proteins, and fats? If you think I'm talking about science fiction here, you're correct. Because I am talking about food from scratch. I am talking about the fabrication, the molecular construction of food. And I'm gonna start by disappointing you, because these foods are pretty complicated, and it is not just around the corner that we are going to cost-effectively be creating most of these foods from primary energy, with one exception. It turns out that fats are actually not that complicated. And so at Savor, this is the first macronutrient that we are making from primary energy. We can make delicious, high-performing fats with a purely chemical process with primary energy as the input. I am talking to you about coal, natural gas, hydrogen, electrons. Pick your flavor. Because any of those flavors, we can produce food at hundreds to thousands of times lower land use, lower water use, lower energy, and we can lower greenhouse gas emissions by 40, by 60, by 100%. So, how do we do it? Again, I told you we're fundamentally trying to bridge from energy to food as directly as possible. So upstream, we have the energy sector in the form of synthetic fuels production. That means gaseous carbon converted to syngas, converted to synthetic fuels. Downstream, we have edible oils. So that's fractionation, that's extraction, that's esterification. We bridge these two worlds. We take the synthetic fuels from the energy space and we oxidize them into the fatty acids that live in the food space. And that is the most direct conversion of primary energy food that we know of. This is paradigm shifting. This is a wildly efficient way to produce food on every metric. Again, land, water, emissions, energy. This is a new way to feed our species. So, can it feed our species? In a word, yes. But I would like us to revisit these flavors of primary energy. Methane. Methane is the means by which we can produce food at the very lowest cost. At world scale, with methane as the feedstock, we can compete with palm oil, commodity palm oil, at $1 per kilogram. And with that adaptation lens on, the reserves of methane on this planet are such that we could feed a population of 10 billion humans 100% of their daily caloric requirements for thousands of years with methane as the feedstock. Now, again, thinking of that adaptation lens, what if we set our sights beyond Earth? We are not going to have access to those reserves of methane anymore. And so electrons are going to have to be our primary source of energy. In this case, we are going to have a slightly higher cost than in the case of methane, where we have some internal energy to that structure. But if we are on, for example, a footprint-limited spacecraft, this is going to be the most efficient means of making baseload calories. And so perhaps before too long, you're going to hear us talking about getting out of that automobile and into the spaceship. And when we do, let's just make sure we have a planet like this to come back to.
Space fat. I knew I needed it in my life. Okay, you can kind of get the pattern of this talk at this point, right? This breakout. So let's imagine, even with full mitigation and full adaptation, are we good? Well, there's still that pesky risk of tipping points that we talked about earlier, right? And for that, we can talk about interventions. These are ways to directly think about engaging with radiative forcing, as well as reducing the consequences of knocking over some of those tipping points. And it's really important to note that interventions are not a replacement for mitigation. That is a total false narrative. Like, it's simple math, right? CO2 is a greenhouse gas that accumulates in the atmosphere. If we don't get to net zero or net negative, there is no amount of intervention that could possibly compensate for that. So that moral hazard that we talk about, while very real, we need to be considerate, is a little bit of a red herring because we're trying to solve very different problems with these different kinds of solutions. And I want to be clear. The question isn't whether or not we want to use interventions. We don't. I would much prefer that we never use interventions because there's risk associated with them, right? But the right framing of the question is not, is there risk of using interventions? The right framing is there more risk in using them than in not using them? And for that, I really encourage us all to reconsider our approach to investing in, through especially government dollars and philanthropic dollars at this time. I don't think it's quite ready for venture potentially. In the research that can help us understand what it would take to build out these playbooks that are gonna get pulled out by someone someday, to better understand them, to better understand which ones have the minimum risks, to really understand those risks. And we should also be deploying dollars on the other side, better understanding our Earth climate system models to understand the risks of not using them. So, but what is an intervention in the first place? It's this like big scary term. We talk about geoengineering and what, right? But there's actually a huge spectrum of what we could mean, even just in radiative forcing management. Painting your roof white is an intervention, right? That's affecting the albedo of that surface. That doesn't feel all that offensive. That can even reduce the urban heat island effect potentially, right? Dealing with airline contrails is an example of a solution that could be conceived of as an intervention. Great. Marine cloud brightening, something a little bit more regional, stratospheric aerosol injection, which is what a lot of people refer to when they say geoengineering, a little bit more global. There's even space-based approaches to radiative forcing management. And so, the point here is that it's not a single playbook, it's not a homogeneous playbook, but it's something that deserves the attention of the community to understand that we absolutely need to get net zero and net negative on all of our GHG emissions. We need to consider all non-anthropogenic sources. We need to do full adaptation. But we also don't want to have tipping points occur, and we need solutions to mitigate that risk. And so, it should be no surprise as we move from solving local problems in climate to solving big global problems in climate, like the atmosphere, that we're moving to global solutions and maybe even the possibility of extraterrestrial solutions. And that, of course, brings us to space, the final frontier. right? We've already heard this summit about the impact of nonlinear technologies like AI on the climate transition, on the clean industrial revolution. And the frontiers of technology can really affect the rate at which we can transition the global energy system in surprising and unprecedented ways. Unlocking access to space could unlock as diverse things as Earth observation, which could help us adapt or deal with wildfires or monitor methane emissions, or space-based manufacturing, or solar, or mining. It could even help us unlock space-based interventions. Here to talk about unlocking the power of space is Andy Lapsa from Stoke.
Thank you so much. Space is maybe off the beaten path a little bit, but it's actually an essential pillar to our ability to solve climate and to sustainably scale our civilization. There are two images that really sear in my brain and carry an outweighted effect on my worldview. The first one is this picture. If you're not familiar, this is the pale blue dot. It's a picture taken by the Voyager spacecraft in 1990. And if you see in the bottom right quadrant, there's a white dot. In the words of Carl Sagan, that's here, that's home, that's us. That's planet Earth. Everything we've ever done, every invention, every dispute, every resolution, everything humanity has ever done, even inventing ice cream, is there on that dot, on that little fleck of dust drifting through the cosmos. The second image is actually a plot. It's this one. This is human population over the last 10,000 years. We've been methodically, slowly but methodically growing for thousands and thousands of years. And then 250 years ago, something happened. What took tens of thousands of years to reach 500 million people now has taken just a handful of generations to reach 8 billion. Now, I don't care who you are or how many talks you attended this week, nobody understands the true impact of this plot on our little fleck of dust. Now, there are all kinds of corollary plots to this, and I encourage you, it's a rabbit's hole, but I encourage you to play in our world of data. It's fascinating. One of those corollary plots is here. This is the same population plot from the last 200 years, now overlaid with energy production. So if we snapped our fingers and solved energy production tomorrow, we still have a lot of mouths to feed. A lot of mouths to feed, in the absence of certain innovations, means a larger footprint on Earth. We've already consumed 50% of the usable landmass on Earth, and that's a statistic, by the way, that a lot of scientists point to as the tipping point to the collapse of civilizations and closed ecosystems. Okay? So the time is now, and it's urgent. Now, space helps us because it provides a very unique vantage. It's a global vantage from which we can do monitoring of all kinds of statistics, data on Earth that's happening. Cooper mentioned monitoring methane emissions. We can take interventions such as advising aircraft in contrail production or detecting wildfire in real time. We can monitor the effectiveness of a lot of the solutions that we talked about today on agricultural production. We can predict seasonal water supply across the globe. These are the things that we can do on a macro scale that are very hard to do from point-based measurements on Earth, and space enables it. Longer term, space is also a precious and unique resource for our ability to mine materials, rare earths, isotopes, other things on orbit to use for our civilization. It also provides a very unique outlet for manufacturing things that we simply can't make in the Earth's gravity well. So as we extrapolate out, space is an absolutely essential, vital pillar of our ability to solve this problem. Now today, we're not particularly great at getting to and from space, especially from space, okay? It's about a 2-year wait time in order to get something on orbit. It's a massive cost. We simply can't do science at scale and at rate in order to solve the problem with today's space technology. And space isn't particularly clean as an activity. This picture is a close-up picture of the engine that powers the best and most ubiquitous rocket that we use today to get to space. It is billowing black carbon soot at every single layer of the atmosphere. Rockets, since they traverse every single layer of the atmosphere, mean that they have about a 500 times higher impact than surface emissions, and black carbon soot is about the worst thing that you can put in the upper atmosphere for radiative forcing. So we need to get these off the road. That's our kind of our position in as Stoke. Our goal is to deliver low-cost, on-demand access to space and back to any orbit at any time at a cost basis that's about 20 times lower than today's and at a 98% lower footprint. Okay? All of these things are achievable by simple architecture decisions that we make up front, and this is exactly what we're building. It's my belief that solving space is not an option. It's actually a moral imperative. To accept anything less would be to accept stagnation and even regression. And if you don't buy that, if we don't master space, then inherently we're accepting the same fate as the dinosaurs. It's just a matter of time. Okay? So I think that that would be a disappointment, and I'm not ready to accept that fate. So space, whether it's near term or long term, is an important and essential pillar for us to solve. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Andy. And could we please give a warm welcome and thanks for all of our breakout speakers today. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you to all of you. I see a lot of friends, I see a lot of partners, I see a lot of members of this community in the audience, and I'm really, really grateful. Thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us all on a journey to a stable climate. And you know, I gotta say, it's a lot. We talked about a lot today. It's kind of scary. But I'm very hopeful. I really believe we can get there. And two things give me hope. The first is all of you, everyone at this summit and everyone beyond this summit. I have to say, I've been working in climate my whole life, and every day I still wake up completely baffled and shocked by the quality and quantity of individuals and institutions that are now committed to this transition. It's amazing. And then the second is really the possibility of surprise. 10 years ago, none of these innovations that you heard about today were thought to be possible, and yet here we are. We have solutions to what we thought were recalcitrant problems. And that's incredible. So the possibility of hope. We don't yet have answers to all the problems that we need to solve to get to a stable climate at a safe temperature, but I really believe that the possibility of hope that's going to be driven by the innovators and entrepreneurs, and then brought to scale and supported by the joint labor of corporates, capital allocators, and policymakers is going to get us there. So thank you, everyone. Let's go close out the summit. Thanks for sticking with us through lunch.
Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for making the time to join this exciting, amazing EPC section. You know, for those of you who are here this morning, you heard about, you know, how much emphasis we put into designing and engineering these first-of-a-kind projects. You know, however, this morning we were at 10,000 feet. We're going to really dive down into, you know, what it takes to build a first-of-a-kind project. I always say construction is really hard. Even remodeling a bathroom usually proves to be really impossible, over budget. There's fights with the contractor, fights with your spouse. You know, it doesn't end well usually. It ends, you know, it ends with a bathroom finish, but the cost of it, emotionally and monetarily, is usually too high. So that's the analogy I always use, because this is even at a much bigger scale, a much bigger problem. And really being thoughtful about it is, you know, one of the missions of Catalyst is really to try to understand, you know, the challenges of building this and how do we overcome those challenges. You know, part of it was, you know, when I brought the team over of infrastructure investors, I was very clear that we needed a construction expert, right? So we brought Ben on. We plucked him out of almost 2 decades at Bechtel, where he was building multi-billion-dollar LNG plants around the world. And we said, you have to come join us because we need that expertise. We need to be able to teach the ecosystem how hard this is. And, you know, the methodology that large-scale industrial players use to build these things And even then they get it wrong. And those things are, LNG plants and chemical plants also face the same issues, even though they have been done many, many times before. So anyway, we have a great panel today. We're going to dive into these issues, and I hope you could learn a lot. This session is closed to media, so media, please identify yourselves and exit stage right, please. This is a conversation where we could be vulnerable. We're really going to share the struggles and really going to share things that are affecting the industry right now. And the way the panel got put together is because basically in the past 5 months, we've seen a lot of projects, CapEx increase significantly. And not just in the emerging climate tech industry, but rather every industry, right? So it is a real issue, and we want to make sure, Summit didn't go by without us talking about it. So that's how the panel came about. Really appreciate you guys being here. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Ben.
That's great. Thanks, Mario. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for everyone's time. We've got about 45 minutes to solve all the problems in any major capital project delivery overrun you've ever come across. So we'll do our best there. We will try and save a little bit of time for Q&A. One of the advantages of being close to the media is hopefully we can also have some discussion at the end, a little bit of intellectual back and forth. So Mario, thank you for framing the session. I actually thought myself that listening in on the 12 keys today was a fantastic session. But thank you so much as well for our panel here. We've got some really good industry leaders, a lot of good messages to learn. I think that we've got some success stories and we've got some lessons learned the hard way. And the goal of the session here is to really share some of those and hopefully get some tangible takeaways. We're a room full, on the whole, we've got a room full of technology startups, a room full of developers. And so we're really trying to frame the message. What is it that you can take away from the message, take back to your project and have a positive next step, getting ready to find the project finance investment. The format that we're going to go through, give or take, we have got 3 main themes. The first one, Mario introduced through the lens of a bathroom remodel, but the first theme is very much capital project delivery is hard. Let's maybe pause for a moment. Let's reflect on how difficult that is on more mature industries in oil and gas, which was my background. We'll spend a little bit of time there. We'll then add the additional lens for what makes it even more challenging for a first-of-a-kind project. So we'll have that as theme 1. Building capital projects is tough. Theme number 2, hopefully is a little bit more takeaways. There are certain things we can do about that. We can think about how do we manage technical and EPC risk, and how can we manage some of those risks through contracts as well. We'll spend a little bit of time with the panel talking through that. Then the last theme, if you will, the third piece of this session, we will spend a little bit of time, is a little bit of a therefore, a little bit of a conclusion. Having recognized the challenges, having understood what we think we control, but still with some uncertainty, the last puzzle piece is there are still a lot of unknown unknowns. And I guess our last toolkit through that lens is let's spend a little bit of time thinking about contingency. When I come to an investor looking for money, really how do I make sure I demonstrate that I've thought about my known risks, but I've also thought about my unknown risks, and how do I think about contingency? So we're going to go through the line here and have everyone introduce themselves. As we get up, and we'll be a little bit transitional here to and from the center of the stage here, but I'd be really keen for our session's title here is Overcoming Challenges, Building First-of-a-Kind Projects. So as each of our panel members introduces themselves, I think we'll get a nice variety of what does building a first-of-a-kind project mean to you. So let's get ourselves on the baseline, get that understanding, and I'll hand over to Roger for an introduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and good afternoon to everyone. Good to have you here. I'm Roger Harris. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Infinium. It depends how you look at it. It could either be an opportunity or misfortune, but I've had the opportunity and or misfortune to do commercialization of first-of-a-kind technologies for the last 20 plus years. Once again, fortune or misfortune, I've had the opportunity to do that on 4 continents, and each of those, whether it be environment or what the technology was, presented their own challenges. To Ben's point on what is a first-of-a-kind or an FOAK, I think there are really 3 aspects to it. It can be new technology blocks, so there's a new or novel technology. It can, and a lot of people overlook this, it can be the integration of known technologies integrated in a different form or to create a different outcome, or it could be putting all of that together for a different commercial application. I think the real challenge for us today, especially with a lot of the first of a kind that we look at, is that they combine aspects of all three, and that creates a really challenging environment.
Appreciate it. Carry on down the line. That's great. Thanks, Roger.
Hi, everyone. Tim Latimer. I'm the CEO of Fervo Energy. We are a geothermal energy developer, and we've incorporated horizontal drilling and other advanced drilling technologies into enhanced geothermal systems, and have finally cracked the nut on making EGS work, which makes geothermal infinitely more scalable than traditional geothermal. In terms of first of a kind, they're incredibly hard. I think we'll talk a lot about that a bit. We are on the other side of a first of a kind project. We actually completed our pilot project, a 3 megawatt facility in northern Nevada. It was the first time anybody had ever used horizontal drilling to produce geothermal energy before, and provided all the technical validation needed to know we were on the right approach. We brought that project online in 2023, and it's been producing for almost a year now. We're now on the second of a kind, but lots of new things there, as you mentioned, that makes it almost first of a kind, because this is now a 400 megawatt project. So we're now in the process of figuring out how do you take the lessons of a 3 megawatt pilot and scale it up into a 400 megawatt facility. And there's a lot of challenges there as well. So happy to talk about that.
That's great. Thanks. Olivia.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Olivia Breeze, and I'm responsible for Europe across the technologies that Ørsted is involved with. And for those of you who don't know us, we are the world's largest offshore wind developer. But the reason that I'm in this circle is really because Breakthrough have made a commitment to invest in one of our several first-of-a-kind projects. So what I'm going to do is answer Ben's question by reference to the various first-of-a-kind projects we have across the portfolio. So the very first offshore wind farm was built in 1991 off the coast of Denmark. The turbines were 0.5 megawatts each, and they were so close to shore you could swim around them. At the moment, we're building 6.8 gigawatts of offshore wind across 3 different continents. So what's the first of a kind project? That very first action, taking onshore turbines and putting them about that far into the sea and calling it an offshore wind farm? Or was the first of a kind project the first gigawatt scale project in the UK? Was it the first gigawatt scale project in APAC? For me, a lot of first of a kind, of course it's about execution, but it is also about scale, and it's also about the enabling business models, and it is also about making sure that you have a route to second, third, fourth of a kind. So that's one answer. The second possible answer is about the carbon capture and storage plant, the carbon capture plant that we are building, which is the largest in Europe, possibly in the world, at our bio facility in Denmark. Why is that first of a kind? Well, because Microsoft is off-taking the carbon credits, which has enabled us to make the commitment to Arca for new technology that they would not otherwise have been able to deploy at scale. And it's also new for us. So that's first of a kind in the sense that it is taking an established asset, which is the biomass plant that we are operating, that was originally a coal plant. So it was a coal plant, then it was a biomass plant, now it's a biomass plant that also captures carbon. Which one of those is first of a kind? It was an amazing coal plant when what the world wanted was coal plants. It was an incredibly efficient conversion to biomass. Now it's producing carbon credits because that's what the world needs. So there's also a first of a kind element there again about, yes, it's about the technology, but it's also about responding to the demands. And then finally, the thing I'm actually supposed to be talking about is the methanol project that we are building in northern Sweden. And that's first of a kind on every possible metric. Yes, a lot of the technology is known. but it's not been integrated at this scale and in this way before. It is producing green methanol, which is, methanol is obviously an extremely well-known compound, so that's not new, but it is new to produce it at scale with no carbon, with no fossil-based carbon emissions. And we're also looking to the maritime industry to actually change their own business model, to stop buying spot, to commit to long-term offtake contracts. So that's also first of a kind for them. So if you ask a literature major to give you a definition, you're going to end up with a very broad definition.
That's great, thanks. Let's carry on down the line. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So Gabriel de Laval, I'm part of Crédit Agricole. Crédit Agricole, if you don't know us, we are a large bank, so 10th largest bank in the world. If you come across project finance, we probably have crossed paths again. We're very active in that field. So I'm the one, bankability, infra, cheap money, that's me. First of a kind, clearly it's not our natural fit, even though we manage more than 200 billion in debt in real assets across various spectrum of assets, so shipping, aircraft, real estate, and of course, project finance, pure project finance. So for us, first of a kind, if you ask me what it is about headaches, endless discussion internally, and a lot of risk that I don't understand and I don't know how to manage. That is my vision as a banker, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn what these 200 billions of assets will be tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So we need to learn. We need to embark on a journey to make sure that we understand the risks that you're onboarding in your first-of-a-kind project. And of course, we're not doing that just for that specific project. It's because we believe that this project will then become 10, 100 similar projects, and we're here to bridge from first-of-a-kind to 100 projects. And that's where you get access to pension funds and real cheap money. If you think that we're cheap, never met a pension fund. So that's a little bit about us. First of a kind, again, we're here to help you. We're here to make your project success. But more importantly, we're here to learn. And that's a little bit why I'm here today, and where I enjoyed that forum so much is I've learned many things. And I still have many things to learn. So please test me, please test me as a banker, and I would be more than happy to provide you with the nuggets on how we think, how we approach this type of unusual risk, to help you to better prepare. Whenever you will have to meet a banker, you will have hopefully a few ideas on how we operate and how we manage this unknown risk.
That was fantastic, thank you. I thought it was important that for everyone to see the lens of that definition of first of a kind. We've got a great panel. They're each bringing different experiences with them, and through that lens of their own definition of first of a kind, now we can start to hear those answers and make sure we're understanding in full. Real quickly there, we heard scaling, we heard integration, we heard responding to demand and defining new markets, and I really like the last one there, Gabriel, on overall it's about managing risk, right? That's really the definition of first of a kind. So without further ado, let's step into what I've defined here as theme one. So we're going to talk about quite how tough building capital projects is. So Roger, it's a very easy question and a much more difficult answer, but if you could share with us what makes building major capital projects so difficult, and let's start through the lens of traditional energy projects, traditional infrastructure. Doesn't matter who you are, the bathroom renovation, the LNG plant, or the first of a kind. Just give us a baseline on why is capital project delivery so difficult?
I think that's exactly it, Ben. It's an easy question with a very difficult answer. I think I'm lucky. I bought a book for my whole team recently by an Oxford group that they've done a study over, I think it's about 100 years, 100 different large-scale projects. And here's the bad news, and Gabriel, maybe you need to close your ears for this one. More than 91% of large capital projects are over budget or over schedule or do not deliver what they're supposed to. Only 1% of major capital projects deliver on time, on budget, and what they're expected to do. That is a staggeringly bad result for anyone putting money into these projects. So what makes them so tough? I think for me, and looking at, as Ben says, just having a look at the traditional ones, first of all, as soon as you have a major project, you have a major planning headache. You've got to develop incredibly complex plans. The human mind is not really that good at managing complex plans or developing them. You've got to have flexible and agile plans and be prepared to take months of planning work and flush it down the drain and start again and do that time and time again. Planning is not a front-end exercise, it's a continuous exercise through the execution of a major project. You have multiple stakeholders, multiple contracts. All of those contracts have to be worked into a contract matrix, and all of that has to have back-to-back synergy and back-to-back agreement. Otherwise, at the end of the day, you're going to wind up, as 99% of those projects did, with a less than desirable outcome. And then finally, and probably most important, once you've done all this front-end loading, created this beautiful picture of just how almost impossible it is going to be to execute, you then need to manage and execute for the next 3, 4, 5 years to deliver that project. I'll stop there.
That's great, Roger. Thanks so much. And straight on the back of that, Tim, if you could add for us the additional complexity lens of what makes the first of a kind that much more difficult for that construction, that execution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a daunting statistics about major capital projects, and I'm not surprised. And then you start talking about that from a first-of-a-kind lens and take all of those complexities and smack on a just massive amount of uncertainty on top of that. Because on a first-of-a-kind project, oftentimes you are still there's still even sometimes science uncertainty, if not technical or engineering uncertainty, in a program that's very unforgiving in terms of changes and uncertainty. But you kind of have to move forward with projects like that, because if you were to actually do things sequentially, you would never get a project done, because you have to just make some judgment calls sometimes. But then you have to make sure you can bring the partners in with you to do that too. So when I think about major project development and capital and first of a kind, I'll give another book recommendation. I think everyone here who's doing this should read Now It Can Be Told, which is the memoirs of General Leslie Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project. So you talk about a massive, complex capital project with a lot of scientific uncertainty, that's probably the peak. And I think, whenever they decided to break ground on the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, the best estimate that they could get from their engineers on the square footage of that facility was within plus or minus 1 order of magnitude. They didn't know if they were building a 500,000 square foot facility or a 50 million square foot facility. They bid the project out to 18 different engineering and construction firms. All of them passed. They had to get President Roosevelt to personally call somebody to force them to do the project and provide his personal guarantee that they wouldn't be held responsible if the project didn't succeed. Not all of us can have the president personally call engineering firms, so you have to figure out how to bring people along with you and get them comfortable with that level of uncertainty. And then whenever you do have to make a change, it could be very unforgiving because of other project issues. On our first project, we sited and began drilling a well. This project was supposed to take 2 years. We're going to drill 3 wells and build some surface facilities to prove out our technology. It became apparent to us within the first month that we drilled the well in the wrong spot. So we wanted to move just 2,000 feet away, and that was a 9-month permitting process, which extended our project timeline by almost 50%, just because we had to re-permit it. So whenever you're having to do these projects and make changes and do it in an ecosystem that is very unforgiving on changes in a timeline, because you're dealing with all of the permit delays and everything else, then it can become very challenging. So first of a kind just ramps up all of the other challenges with major capital projects that makes it very difficult.
That's really appreciated. Thank you, Tim. So that was just really a baseline. I don't think there's too much there that people didn't know already, but do maybe pause for a moment. Imagine all of those 99%. How many of them were sitting in the chair there looking through the reality lens of, oh, but it's okay, mine is probably the one that will find that cost and schedule performance? It's not a fun message to stand up here and deliver. It's a message that, I've seen as well in 20 years, building, de-risked LNG plants. These things are challenging, they're complex, the interfaces. So it's a real challenge out there. And credit to everyone in this room for still being here in their room, despite those challenges. Let's maybe even spin it to something a little bit more positive. Olivia, in your introduction there, you referenced your your first offshore wind. And if you could share any of those sort of key threads through the lens of our startup and our developer community here, what were some of those key puzzle pieces to build the first of a kind and really help mature an asset class that today we think of as a lot more de-risked and ready for that infra investment?
So I think if I take it to people, actually, because you have to be a little bit crazy and and have a very strong positivity bias, no offense to my fellow panelists, to want to build first-of-a-kind projects. But if you have that very strong positivity bias, you also put yourself massively at risk of underestimating the risks that you're going to face. And the one thing you can be absolutely 100% certain of is that things will go wrong, that they will go wrong in a way that is different from what you expected. It will almost certainly cost more, it will almost certainly take longer. And people who are visionary and brave and committed to these challenging technologies have to remind themselves about all those bad things as well and make sure that they've thought them into the schedule. And so when I think about how did offshore wind get from where it was in '91 to where it is today, I think there are a couple of things for me that really stand out, and most of them are not actually engineering based. The first is, to go back to your point about President Roosevelt, the first is that governments passionately wanted it. They passionately wanted it. They believed that it would be a way of bringing large-scale electrons close to load centers in markets that otherwise were constrained from having those electrons. So there was a real demand pull. That was super important. And it also meant that they were able to put pressure on a lot of the first-of-a-kind companies who then moved into that space. So at the time, we were 100% state-owned. Could we have done that without our owner ringing up the CEO, and our owner being the Prime Minister of Denmark, ringing up the CEO and saying, we think you should do this instead of building another coal plant in Germany? Because for most large corporates, another coal plant in Germany back in 1991, that looks like a great deal. The funding is there, it's low risk, someone wants it. Why would you go and do the next thing unless there's a very, very strong pull? So I think there's a visionary leadership point that's super important. There's a capabilities point. Turbines are not new technology, or they weren't then, they're certainly not now. And so the capabilities were there to do the complicated planning, to really understand not only how the turbines worked in theory, but there was real partnership with the OEM community. And I think that what you were saying before about what happens when the schedule starts to shift, actually in my experience, when the schedule starts to shift, that's when you discover whether your OEMs are partners or whether they're contractors. Because if your OEMs are contractors and the schedule starts to shift, they rub their hands together and they think, oh, variation orders and money and opportunity. And if they're partners, then they come and sit next to you at the table and they work out how you're all going to go forward together. And we were incredibly lucky, or Siemens were incredibly lucky, I think you can play it both ways, to have a very, very large-scale project partnership with Siemens, which allowed them to invest in scaling up the manufacturing, but it also allowed us to put engineers into their factories, which they really didn't enjoy, so that we could get really comfortable with what they were building and how it was going to work. Because I think my last point would be making sure that you think operations into construction. So just as you would never take FID without knowing how you were going to build the plant, or at least having some idea on how you were going to build the plant, so you should never get to the end of construction and look around and be like, well, who's going to operate this thing? Actually, you want the operator, if it's you, whether it's you and you need to hire people or it's a third party, you want them involved from the design stage. And you want them coming all the way through with you on the construction stage, because they will know what the little tweaks are that make it possible for them to operate as efficiently as possible with the maximum possible uptime. And actually on a first-of-a-kind project, when the economics can be very marginal, that matters enormously as well.
Terrific, Olivia. Thanks so much. And it's great to get that lens and hopefully that reassurance that even if we are all crazy in the room here, that there is those demonstrated examples of success stories and the industry is really growing. So that's fantastic. So we've given ourselves, to save some time for questions, all of 20 minutes now to solve the rest of the entire puzzle. Let's lock our CapEx into a number that we're all happy with, that we can all invest behind. But let's jump straight into our theme 2, if you will, which is how do we manage technical, EPC, and contractual risk. And we're going to quickly go down the line here and answer a question in turn. But Gabriel, let's start with you maybe. When you're reviewing a project opportunity, how do you view technical and EPC risks? And what recommendations do you have for our startups and developers here to help them arrive at that starting line with the right handle around it and manage it beyond FID as well?
So the key question for us on what is happening on construction is what could go wrong and how much would that cost me? I'm the least smart person in the room. I want to put any risk into a number. See a banker like that. You will put him in front of him a technical risk, he will see a number in hard dollars. So that's the way we operate, most of us. Of course, we're going to be digging very deeply into the technical aspects of the project. And so until now, I think that we are exiting a very comfortable situations where most projects, actually we didn't have so much of first of a kind. This is relatively new, at least for us, but I think for the entire industry. We've been financing renewables for ages. We've been financing industries for ages. We have data. We have track records. We know what could go wrong. So when we were looking at EPC contract and technical risk, actually, we knew more or less what we were facing. And we could design a financing plan that would then answer the uncertainties that we knew could happen. First of a kind is completely different. We have to start from a blank sheet. And whereas yesterday we had EPC contractors able to provide some wrap-up and give us some very clear commitments on what they could achieve in terms of cost, delays, and performance, we don't have that anymore for first of a kind. And that's a big challenge for us. Doesn't mean that we can't operate, but it's a big challenge, I think, if it stays the same for the next projects, I would say. So the first thing is that we don't have the EPC wraps and the EPC comfort that we had in the past, so we have now to do our own analysis and making sure that first we understand the risks, the technical risks of this first of a kind. It's not easy, and then try to quantify that. It's very important to quantify this risk for us because our main friend, I would say, is Excel. And we're using financial projections to make sure that our debt in 99% scenarios will be repaid. And the way we would then look at these first of a kind and all, again, the uncertainties is looking at the key parameters of this financial model and what could go wrong and how wrong could that be. And that's where we need your help, and we need your honest help in telling us, this is my unknown margin. Because then I can price, or I could put the contingencies in my financial model and making sure that your financing plan or the financing plan that I'm putting in front of you will not put your project in danger if something goes wrong, because that's the last thing that we want. So we're moving from a very lazy situations where all the risks were offshoreized to EPC sponsors, etc., because they were well known, to a situation where, as Olivia mentioned, we're all partners, but if you really want to have a partner in the room, you need to be honest, you need to be transparent, and then we can do our work. So that's where now our creativity, I would say that as a banker, you don't see us as creative, but we can be creative, and that's where we have to invent new financing plan and new debt structure that could accommodate all the uncertainties that you would bring to the table with your first of a kind. So that's a little bit what I want to leave with you is, of course, transparency and trying to help us to identify anything that could go wrong within certain boundaries. We know we'll discuss the unknown unknowns, but at least the known unknowns, and making sure that we can, again, accommodate that in our financial model and propose a solution that is workable for all of us.
That's great, Gabriel. Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to switch the order here and, Tim, put you on the spot a little earlier than you were expecting. I know that at Fervo, you've got some, let's call them opportunities in terms of how you feel the EPCs, how you feel they should be arriving at the table versus how they are arriving at the table. If you could sort of share through your lens of maybe some of the challenges you're having with those EPCs, and again, any sort of lens that you can share on how should our startups and developers be thinking about approaching EPC contracts.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think maybe I'll start by referencing back. What was the stat you shared at the beginning? How many projects are over time and over budget?
91%.
91%. So 91% of projects are over time and over budget. And if you look over the time span of that analysis, the EPC firms that you go to in the market now are the same EPC firms that have managed all of those projects. And it's one thing I find a little bit baffling that we have an industry with the success rate of 9%. And we're told that as a new startup company, you need to get to a stage where you can hand your project over to an EPC, and we're intentionally coached to push our projects into an industry that has a 9% success rate. And I'm always surprised that there's not more of a challenge to this whole model, and it's something I find a little bit baffling. I started my career as a drilling engineer, and I work in upstream oil and gas, and upstream oil and gas does not use EPCs. You do all the engineering and operations and management internally, and I started Fervo, and we started doing that the same way, because we're drilling wells. It's very similar to my prior career, and we hired a bunch of people from the oil and gas industry who had experience in that. And I actually remember, my own naiveness. I remember one of the first meetings whenever we started engaging with the project finance community, and I was asked, who's doing your engineering? And I was the most baffling question to me. And I was like, my engineers are doing my engineering. And I think I see a lot of other startup founders in the room, and I don't know if y'all have had a similar experience, especially in this room in the Breakthrough portfolio. A lot of us we are engineers and scientists, and we staff our team with engineers and scientists and people who are great at execution. And then we always get to a point where you're supposed to hand the project off to somebody else. And I don't know if that's always the right model for this kind of innovation. And so in our world, about half our CapEx is in the drilling and half is in the power plant. The power plant is a world where it's more common to use EPCs, but we have no choice other than to manage the project ourselves on the subsurface. And that's always interesting, because as we start thinking about allocation of risk, well, there's a couple things we've done. Is one, we want to take everything that's new and scary and do it ourselves, and really only hand off to the EPC stuff that is completely normal. So we're using the same kind of geothermal power generation technology that the industry's used for over 40 years. There's 400 different organic Rankine cycle power plants, and we've drawn a tight fence around the scope of what we bid out to EPCs to make sure they're actually not doing anything new. If it's anything new, it's our team doing it, not them. So we've allocated risk and bifurcated the scope in a way that can be done. But the other thing that's interesting is that really keeps the EPC honest, because we are actually building a lot of things. We know what concrete costs. We know what labor costs in our area. We've built roads. We've drilled wells. And we have actually de-scoped from our EPC a lot of work, because they say, okay, this is going to cost us, our class 3 cost estimate for this is $6 million. And we say, well, we just did that exact thing, and it cost us $300,000. So we're pulling that scope back into us. And the geothermal industry is an industry that the biggest companies in geothermal normally self-perform and do these projects internally. So there's just not a lot of depth of experience in EPCs out there for building these plants. And so we're trying to staff up our team to manage even more of these projects internally. We are working with an EPC because we're really pushed by the project finance community to do that. But we're really trying to manage them as tightly as possible, as their scope is limited, and we have a real tight control over their costs. And we've built out the capabilities to do that. But I just think it's something that I just am continually surprised that no one ever questions the whole model of how this works. When we're all talking about how it's never ever successful, and then we are just going down the same path over and over again. So I think we all need to challenge ourselves to be a little bit more creative about how project management works when we're trying to get new technology to market faster.
That's a great message, and I saw Olivia glance over. Did you have something to add there?
I think only that classic project finance principles would tell you that the person who is best able to manage the risk is the person who cares about it the most and is the least likely to walk away from it. And in almost every case, that's the sponsor.
And maybe to complete, what an important element as well is that even within a bank, and I experienced that when looking at Power-to-X projects. Power-to-X is a lot of power and a lot of oil and gas. So the question was, who do we put in the room? Is it our power team or oil and gas team? And we put all of them together. They couldn't agree on the proper structure because the oil and gas industry was coming with their hat in, well, the sponsors is taking all the risk, whereas the power has some very tight EPC component in it. And even within a bank, just to let you know, it seems like we have some rigid, list of things and points to tick. But it's not even true. Like between a sector and a team to another, it's completely different mindset, completely different way to approach the risk. And that's what we're trying to do by being creative, is making sure that we know that some of this actually worked in the past. So we're trying to take the best from all of those various sectors, best stories and best risk mitigation, and making sure that for this first-of-a-kind projects, it would work. It's not easy, but just to tell you that there is no one single framework that works, and there are multiple.
So I think that was a great conversation, and Tim, thanks for leading that through. No offense taken, having spent the first 20 of my years of my career thinking that it must be me, I need to be the one to solve the solution. But if I may add, what I really liked, my takeaway from your message was you've bifurcated the situation. There's going to be certain components that for you, Fervo, or for the specifics of the technology, be it Infinium or anyone else, there's certain components that that you are the best positioned person at that table to solve the problem. Now, by all means, you're going to engage the EPC for their support, but I'd say at the same time, we should also be thinking about there are other aspects that the EPCs will be bringing their own best practice, and it's, as Gabriel sort of helped frame it at the end, finding that right balance specific to your technology, specific to your project, that the best foot forward is probably going to be that combination. So through that lens, I'm going to hand over to Roger here. I was very fortunate as we went through the diligence process for the Roadrunner project. We spent some time down in Corpus Christi, and we spent a lot of time reviewing the development plans for Roadrunner project as well in Pecos, Texas. So one of the absolute themes that has underpinned the discussion so far is managing work process, managing known unknowns, managing unknown unknowns. And I think that one of the key themes is, and Mario mentioned it this morning, is so often we invest and we have to ultimately put the capital behind confidence that the team of people are the ones that are going to solve the problems that come your way. And I'd say that one of the key things and one of the key confidences in our investment in Infinium is that team. So if you could share some of your best practices that you built through that pilot plant in Corpus Christi and that you're leveraging into that Roadrunner project, it'd be great to share what those messages are.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm just going to make it really easy and just paraphrase what the rest of the panel has really said. I think, as Olivia said, you've got to build a team of crazy people. That's like probably the most important part. But I think, maybe going through it in just a few simple steps to a really complex question. I think when looking at a team to execute, you need the right people. And Tim spoke to that. The right people aren't necessarily someone you contract with. It's someone who has the expertise in what you want to do and has real insight there. So the right people. I'll be honest to all the people getting ready for their first of a kind. You need more people than you think you need. So add on another 50% there, because you are going to need more people, and you need them early. So if you think you're going to get the right people at the right time, that's wrong. You need the right people way before you get to the problem. Otherwise, you're going to be SOL at that point. What sort of people do you want? You want subject matter experts, but I think most importantly, you want problem solvers, because everyone knows in a first of a kind, it's the unknown unknowns that we've all been speaking about that are the ones that really catch you. And so it's great to have someone who's a compressor expert or a syngas expert, but you really need people who are experts at solving the unknown. Most importantly in that team, be it the people you hire, the people you contract with, or the people you partner with, as Olivia said, you need people that take ownership and accountability and share your end goal. You can't have people that are managing to contract. You've got to have people that are managing to vision. And, I think maybe lastly then, in talking about a really important member of your team that is very seldom spoken about, but that we clearly recognize in Ben and his team. It's your investor. If you're building a first-of-a-kind facility and you're looking for investors that are going to put money into it and expect a return out of it, and that's their only interaction with the project, that is not the right investor for a first-of-a-kind. You need the sort of investor that knows a first-of-a-kind does not go according to plan, and they're not going to ask you, what are you going to do? How are you going to solve this? They say, what are we going to do? How do we solve this? How do we walk with you here, find the best solution? And really, at the end of the day, you need an investor that shares the end vision, the end goal, the end objective, and cherishes that and wants to make that a success, not someone who just wants to see you return on the project.
Well, that was some great discussion and great input. We really appreciate it. I did want to say, well, we've still got maybe 10 to 15 minutes for questions in just a moment, but I was a little bit interested. I think you can probably tell that one of my sort of themed goals here, or one of my intended takeaways, is we've got a lot of confidence in the room. We've got a lot of phenomenal ideas. We've got some amazing technologies, but we do want to really bring home, do keep in mind the unknown unknowns. And just as a way to maybe help highlight that one point, we're going to do one very quick fire round here. And we're going to talk about the most unexpected unknown unknown that you've come across in your project or in your experience to date. The goal here is not for you to think, I think I'm going to have that unknown unknown. It's more an understanding of the range of unknown unknowns that are out there, and know that there are going to be some of those in your closet that can come out. So let's do a quick once down the line. Roger just spoke last, so we'll maybe start with Raphael. What was the most surprising unknown unknown you've come across?
I'm not sure that the room will believe me. It was a dinosaur.
Fantastic.
True story. Dinosaur skeleton for an infrastructure project delayed the earthworks by 9 months.
And you're talking about the EPC there, or the, okay.
And that's the way to solve it. And maybe just to repeat what has been said, there is no contingency, there is no money that could solve the dinosaur problem. It's about partners. It's about making sure that your clients are partners, that your EPCs are partners, that everyone actually understands the problem you're in, and are able to accommodate, to go beyond the commercial agreements that you've decided and that you negotiated very hard 2 months before that. So it's really about first of a kind. I think that the partnership is even more important, and especially to deal with the unknown unknown.
Appreciate that. Olivia, would you like to share an unknown unknown?
I think my unknown unknown is always, by definition, the thing you don't expect. So perhaps most recently, it was the balance of plant, which is basically pouring concrete onto the ground. But Fantastic. It was much harder than we expected.
Wonderful. Yeah, it was in the closet waiting. Tim, have you got one to share?
Yeah, I think unknown unknowns can go in any direction. I guess I don't know if this is as surprising as a dinosaur, but probably like a lot of overly confident entrepreneurs, we underestimated our cost for our first project, learned our lesson. It took way longer to drill than we expected, and so we built forecasts for our second project that was way more conservative. And then we turned a corner, and now we're dramatically beating those estimates, and it's actually throwing our schedule way off because we're drilling way faster than we need to, and we're actually now way out of balance with the construction side of the surface facilities, and now having to deal with all kinds of things of, okay, now that these wells are going to be sitting idle for 2 years instead of coming on just on time, what do we do with that? So surprises can go in any direction, and even good news can be very disruptive for a project.
That's a great lens as well, and you specifically gained the benefit through the pilot of uncovering what at that time was an unknown. The overcorrection is its own issue, but that's a good story of what the pilot can help flush out. And Roger, lastly with you before we open up for questions, any surprising unknown unknowns?
I can't beat a dinosaur. That's the best one I've heard. But I'd say a cooling water circuit that didn't function. And the key takeaway for me there is when we look at first of a kind, we put the magnifying focus on the sexy catalyst reactors, the novel, the new stuff, and the real key takeaway is there, when you're doing first of a kind, you've got to sweat the small stuff as well as the big stuff. If you don't have a cooling water loop that works, you can't get to the sexy stuff. You delayed and you start spending money.
Fantastic. That's really appreciated. So that was the 45-minute sort of plan sets of questions, if you will. It'd be great if anyone would like to sort of put their hand up and maybe kick us off with the first question. If anyone's got one, it'd be great to hear for our panel. Yeah, please, Phil.
Thanks so much. My name is Phil DeLuna. I work for a Canadian carbon removals project developer called Deep Sky. A question for the panel. In many of these FOAC projects, government, policy, regulation, these are known unknowns, but they're also unknown unknowns. So do you have any advice on how you meet with these non-technical challenges, specifically when it comes to permitting, regulation, and government, and especially public acceptance within the community?
Open floor.
I can take a first stab. I think one of the ways that we've specifically tried to deal with that is early engagement, but really finding the right location that is that is interested to have your business. I think it gets back to what Olivia says. You got to think of all of these stakeholders as partners and not just contractual entities. If you're dealing purely with a contractual entity, you're not in the right location. You've got to deal with governments, local councils, the community that wants you there, wants to see you succeed, sees the benefit that you're going to bring to their community, and obviously you've got to reciprocate that. You can't just be in there to pull something out of the ground and get away. You've got to be there to create jobs, create a future for that community.
I think the other thing that's difficult in that context is getting the balance right, whether it's with the community or with government. You want them to believe you can deliver, but you don't want them to believe it's going to be easy, because it certainly won't be easy, and you need their support, and you also need their patience. So I think a huge amount of it is actually about building trust, so that you're open about what you see as the challenges and where you need their help and where you need their support and where you feel that you have something to contribute. But it's actually about admitting the vulnerability of, I don't know whether we can do this. I don't know whether this is the right place to do it, but I'm interested in having the conversation. And I think the more that you open up for a conversation rather than just going with a laundry list of asks, the more likely you are to be able to build the kind of partnership that actually enables you to deliver on it.
That's great, and it's probably an answer I'm going to give for any other questions that crop up as well. We talked a little bit, certainly in the 12 keys, that transition from a technology company and a CTO, really, have you thought about how you're going to build out that team? That project development process is a lot more than just the technical de-risking or the construction de-risking. It branches into permitting and offtake and so many puzzle pieces. So to an extent, have you built the in-house skills that you're going to need regularly enough? And have you even budgeted and thought about the advisory services you need as well? And I think permitting and regulatory is a very good space to think about advisor support to help you think about it and take it out of the unknown unknowns and get as much information on the table as you can. So appreciate the question, appreciate the answers. Around the room, yes, please.
Hi there, my name is Christian Weeks with Inverid Systems. A question building off a comment Tim made about business model. When you insourced some of the project development for the pilot project, is your vision then that that's your business model going forward, or do you think about insourcing to essentially de-risk and then ultimately wanting to transfer that development process to third parties to scale the business? How do you think about that first of a kind, ultimately leading to a scalable development model?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's going to be completely different depending on what technology and which part of the process is the most proprietary and what's more standard. One thing we've thought about with this, as I mentioned, in the geothermal industry, most of the bigger developers insource everything. And so there's just not kind of that same normal process of working with an EPC. And as we thought about this from a financing standpoint, a business model standpoint, what we realized is that kind of what you do for the first big project really sets the tone, because obviously taking on more scope internally and putting less into an EPC contract, that makes financing a lot more challenging. That gets people uncomfortable with the risk of the project. But if you do it on the first one, then you can do it on the second one most likely because you have a track record. The alternative is the more you outsource early on, then it becomes more difficult to pull that in because that becomes the norm in the industry. So I think every industry is going to be different, and I think it really depends on what's proprietary and how much can be standardized and maybe farmed out to contractors. But I think one of the things we've tried to be very thoughtful about is how we set up the first big project will set the tone for the rest. So if we ultimately want to bring things in-house, you have to do that at some point or another, and it may be even more challenging if there's such a strong norm around using external parties for some of the work in the beginning.
Really appreciate the question and appreciate the answer. And we probably should have said it at the get-go that I don't think anyone in reality has all the answers to all the questions that we've got in here, right? I think we've got to be very honest, very direct that just capital project delivery, it kind of loops back to it's difficult. We're always going to have problems. We're going to have overruns. We can have the best laid plans. And then retrospectively, maybe I should have used the integrator for that component of engineering because there was something I hadn't realized. So we're always going to be having the challenging ourselves, the back and forwards. But it really, some good shares there. Around the room, anyone here? Please, ma'am.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask the first question that was asked, so I'm going to have to pivot. Okay. I'm with DNV, independent engineering firm, Fantastic. Global. So the question that I was going to ask about proving the technology as well as bankability, because there was a question about in-house versus using external engineers. I just wanted to hear if that has been something that you found to be helpful in terms of either using an independent engineering firm. And I promise it's not a sales pitch for DNV. I'm just genuinely curious.
Let me first give the bank's point of view, and then maybe an independent engineer can act differently for sponsors. The key question again is what can go wrong? And we are using independent engineers to help us in shedding the light on what could go wrong and how much can it go wrong. So we do have in-house engineers, but they don't have the technical capabilities on everything. So yes, you having some third-party reports or third-party validations of some technical output of your technologies is very useful, because then, again, back to the financial model, when you're looking at the technical assumptions, there are some technical assumptions that was, okay, these ones we don't need to bother too much because someone has tested it intensively and it's proven to be the correct assumption that is there. So that's how we use independent engineers. So yes, the more uncertainties we have in our financial model, the more we're going to rely on any type of data that can help us support the business case.
If I could add quickly to that, advice to any other founders in the room, engage those independent engineers as soon and as early as you possibly can. The way the world works in these passing off through the valley of death and everything, it's fascinating because most seed stage venture funds are not going to spend money on an independent engineering report. They're writing a check size that's too small to justify that kind of expense. And so oftentimes they'll do technical diligence, but not through the form of a traditional brand name independent engineer. So you can make it very, very far as a company without engaging an independent engineer, but then you run into the wall of infrastructure finance. And what you run into is if you've spent 5 years iterating on a design and kind of reinventing how an industry does something, and then you try to teach somebody that to somebody all in one go, it's really complicated. And so I got advice from a mentor really early on to just go talk to them. It doesn't need to be a financial transaction. Just regularly update the 2 or 3 biggest independent engineering firms in your industry on what you're doing, so when the time comes, it's not completely new to them. And that's something that has saved us an enormous amount of time and headache, because we've kind of brought that engineering community along with us as we iterate.
Thank you. That ended up being our last question, so we appreciate it instead of the first to last. I did just want to take a moment to thank our esteemed panel here. I hope it's been a constructive discussion for everyone in the room. I'm hoping that the variance of experiences, technology, and skill set backgrounds means that you each have maybe your own specific takeaway. But I think it's difficult not to end on the one that Olivia shared with us, that we're all crazy with an optimism bias. So maybe that's probably our correct wrap up. And thanks for our panel, and thanks for the discussion.